During the season of ripening chokecherries, a momentous assembly takes place along the Little Bighorn River, referred to as greasy grass by the Sioux and Cheyenne. Thousands of indigenous warriors have gathered, ready to confront the advance of 700 white soldiers dispatched from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. These soldiers intend to compel the tribes back to their reservations, underestimating the resolve of the united indigenous forces at this historic site. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, commanding his 7th Cavalry, is eager to prevent the tribes from scattering into the hills. However, this time, the indigenous warriors are resolute in their decision not to retreat. Custer splits his troops, sending Captain Bentine to guard against potential threats from the south, while Major Reno is instructed to move forward and attack the unseen village. As Reno crosses the river and charges ahead, he suddenly stops and dismounts his men, uncertain of Custer's location. The battle intensifies rapidly, with Reno finding himself in the midst of fierce combat. Bloodied and overwhelmed, he retreats toward the bluffs across the river, abandoning wounded soldiers in a chaotic scene as indigenous warriors pursue them with relentless determination. This encounter represents Reno's first combat experience against indigenous forces, a moment that will be forever marred by controversy surrounding his actions during this critical engagement. Upon reaching the bluffs, 1/3 of his men have already perished in what would later be known as Custer's last stand. This account highlights a crucial moment in American history, centering on the Battle of the Little Bighorn and its wider implications. The conflict began when a group of indigenous warriors ceased their attack and retreated northward just before Bentine's forces arrived, having received an urgent communication from Custer regarding a significant village nearby. However, hills obstructed their view of Custer's position. Following a cautious search, the indigenous forces regrouped, resulting in an intense clash where 350 soldiers fought bravely until dusk. The battle resumed at dawn the next day, but by evening the indigenous warriors retreated, securing a temporary victory for leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Concurrently in Philadelphia, the Centennial Exposition marked the centenary of the Declaration of Independence. This celebratory event was abruptly marred by the devastating news of Custer's death in Montana, which stirred deep sorrow throughout the nation. The text examines the historical backdrop of U.S. expansionism and its repercussions for indigenous populations, critiquing the justification of such domination through noble ideals that were fundamentally driven by greed. The narrative emphasizes that cultural assimilation was expected solely from those who adhered to European norms. The Cherokees' attempts to adapt are acknowledged. They created a written language, established educational institutions, and engaged in agricultural practices. Nevertheless, despite their efforts to integrate, they faced dispossession as white settlers encroached on their territories, resulting in forced relocations. The idea of a melting pot did not apply to Native Americans, who were confined to lands considered separate and inferior. Initially perceived as barren deserts, these areas were inhabited by impoverished indigenous farmers until the arrival of horses around 1730 transformed their hunting methods. This introduction of horses shifted their lifestyle towards nomadic hunting. As both indigenous groups and white settlers moved westward, indigenous peoples were pushed by settlers and attracted by horses, leading to the emergence of a new cultural blend known as the Plains Indians. This coalition formed swiftly around 1800, but encountered escalating challenges due to the increased mobility and advanced weaponry introduced by European settlers, intensifying conflicts among these diverse groups. Indigenous conflicts escalated as the state of peace deteriorated, making warfare a prominent feature of Plains culture. The powerful Sioux Nation, a significant force among the Plains Indians, faced numerous adversaries. Together with their limited allies, the Cheyenne, they fought against the Crow, who were well known for their superior horses. In 1823, the Sioux managed to drive the Crow from their territory. Custer's leading scouts were Crow Indians, eager to reclaim their land. Meanwhile, towns with Native American names, such as Omaha and Chicago, were evolving into thriving white settlements. In 1841, a wagon train of settlers journeyed through the core of Sioux hunting grounds, facilitating the establishment of the Oregon Trail. White settlers began to cultivate the rich lands beyond the expansive American desert. The gold rush of 1849 prompted a wave of prospectors to head towards California. By 1850, various agencies and forts were established across the plains under the guise of protecting both indigenous peoples and settlers. Traditional Indian hunting grounds were increasingly fragmented, leading buffalo herds to migrate north and south as indigenous communities followed their movements. In 1855, during a council meeting, the Sioux resolved to resist further encroachment by white settlers, a position they upheld until their eventual defeat more than 20 years later. While minor uprisings occurred, by the conclusion of the Civil War, southern hunting territories were being inundated by settlers. In an extraordinary winter march spanning over 400 miles, southern tribes allied with their northern counterparts, raising alarm among eastern whites. President Ulysses S. Grant aimed to implement a peace policy during this chaotic period. Numerous Quakers offered their services, convinced that it was the duty of white settlers to civilize Native Americans through compassion, peaceful persuasion, and education. Nevertheless, some white individuals regarded this approach as overly idealistic and impractical, while indigenous peoples perceived it as indicative of white frailty. Concurrently, a wave of Civil War veterans was sent westward, resulting in the creation of new military forts. Despite this, formal military engagements were limited. A few thousand lives were lost due to armed confrontations, but alternative tactics proved to be far more destructive. Diseases spread through tainted blankets often wiped out entire tribes. Alcohol was another weapon used against them. Food supplies were intentionally disrupted, and millions of buffalo disappeared within a short span of years. The most effective strategy employed by white settlers involved treaties. In the 3 years following the Civil War, the government negotiated approximately 400 treaties with Native Americans. However, these agreements were often breached by both sides. In 1868, a new treaty was established in which the Sioux consented to halt hostilities that were obstructing railroad construction in exchange for relinquishing a sacred area known as Baja Sapa, or the Black Hills. This region was considered the spiritual center of the Sioux, viewed as the home of the Great Spirit and the source of life. A century earlier, it had belonged to the Kiowa, but the Sioux had driven them and other tribes away. Red Cloud, the most notable leader among the Indian moderates, agreed to sign the treaty, while Sitting Bull refused. As a firm advocate for the preservation of the indigenous way of life, Sitting Bull severed his relationship with Red Cloud and permanently left the reservations with his followers, while Red Cloud opted to remain. For years, rumors regarding gold in the Black Hills had been circulating. Upon the discovery of gold, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sought to minimize its importance. In contrast, newspapers heralded the find, drawing a large influx of gold prospectors. Military attempts to deter these newcomers were unsuccessful. Concurrently, challenges emerged on the reservations, where followers of Red Cloud faced severe food shortages, prompting many to consider aligning with Sitting Bull and his dissenting faction for the first time. Indian agents exacerbated the crisis by diverting supplies meant for Native Americans and selling them to post traders instead. Although their official compensation was $1,500, some agents were reportedly earning as much as $15,000. These traders then sold goods to soldiers at inflated prices, taking advantage of a system that mandated military personnel to buy from them. This corruption adversely affected both white settlers and Native Americans. This scenario proved politically beneficial for Democrats who were discontent with President Grant's compassionate policies towards Native Americans and called for an investigation into alleged corruption within his War Department. The New York Herald accused Secretary of War William Belknap of awarding traitorships based on leaked classified information from Custer. Custer, incensed by the exploitation impacting both his troops and Native Americans, also had his own political aspirations. His swift ascent during the Civil War had garnered significant public attention, and a notable victory over the Sioux, widely reported in the media, could potentially secure him the Democratic presidential nomination as the convention neared. By June 27, the scandals surrounding Grant escalated, with his brother Orville becoming embroiled in the controversy. Ultimately, the government abandoned its peace policy. The disputes regarding the Black Hills provided a rationale for both parties to end a fragile 7-year truce. Hostile groups were ordered to return to their reservations, but refused to comply. The government ultimately renounced its peace strategy. The disputes regarding the Black Hills provided a justification for both parties to end a tenuous 7-year ceasefire. Hostile factions were ordered to return to their designated reservations, but chose to defy this directive. Troops are preparing to advance against the opposition, with Custer appointed to lead the Dakota Column. In the meantime, Ben is called to Washington, where he delivers damaging testimony against Secretary Belknap in front of a congressional committee, provoking the president's ire. Upon his return to Bismarck by train, Custer discovers that he has been removed from his command by presidential decree and is barred from participating in the expedition. Bismarck is thriving, largely due to the 1868 treaty, which has delayed the Northern Pacific Project. The town is inundated with gamblers, criminals, and disreputable women, all partaking in a potent whiskey produced just beyond its borders. Enlisted men are arriving in large numbers, moving from the train to the ferry to cross the Missouri River to Fort Lincoln on the opposite shore. All are volunteers as military conscription has ceased. They include idealistic young men attracted to the western frontier and minor offenders escaping eastern prisons. Many are illiterate or European immigrants, and most are in dire financial straits. They generally harbor contempt for their officers, referring to Custer as a hard ass. The officers themselves represent a varied group. Captain Frederick Bentine particularly looks down on his fellow officers, especially the young Custer. 8 years earlier, Custer had abandoned part of his command during a battle that brought him and his regiment notoriety. Bentine's associate was later discovered brutally mutilated. Major Reno also holds resentment towards Custer, having been denied his request for command in the forthcoming campaign. He is surrounded by loyal friends and enthusiastic public backing, yet he contends with relentless adversaries. His professional future is precarious as he appeals to General Terry, the newly appointed commander who lacks experience in Indian warfare, to support his cause. As public demand intensifies, Grant agrees to allow Custer to take on a limited role as the commander of the 7th Cavalry. Despite being instructed not to bring a newspaper correspondent, he intends to do so and begins devising plans to outsmart Terry and achieve a personal triumph. Most of his regiment is unfamiliar with Native American culture and harbors fears of the unknown. The account of the Battle of the Little Bighorn illustrates the intricate relationships between indigenous leaders and U.S. military forces, particularly emphasizing the contributions of Sitting Bull and other Native American chiefs in rallying their communities against the advancing settlers. Sitting Bull, who transitioned from a warrior chief to a spiritual leader by the age of 42, became a pivotal figure in inspiring resistance among the Northern Plains Indians. His leadership was vital as numerous Native Americans abandoned reservations, driven by the conviction that they could oppose the U.S. government's insistence on returning to assigned territories. They regarded Sitting Bull as a beacon of resistance, particularly since he had never consented to a treaty that would validate their removal. As tensions heightened, Sitting Bull sought visions to direct his people. In a significant demonstration of faith, he undertook a vision quest that involved considerable physical sacrifice, interpreting his visions as omens of forthcoming victory over U.S. forces. This stood in stark contrast to the experiences of U.S. soldiers, who often remained disconnected from the realities faced by their opponents and regarded them with contempt. The conflict that took place on June 25, 1876, was characterized by Custer's significant strategic blunders. He split his forces into 3 separate units, failing to recognize the strength and unity of the native warriors. This error resulted in Custer's last stand, leading to the demise of him and his entire contingent. In the aftermath, there was a surge in military initiatives aimed at quelling native resistance, which ultimately led to tragic incidents such as the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. The legacy of this battle has come to represent the larger struggles between indigenous populations and U.S. expansionism. It signifies not only a fleeting triumph for Native Americans, but also foreshadows their eventual subjugation and forced integration into white society. In spite of this grim reality, indigenous values and identities have endured, contesting narratives that attempt to erase cultural distinctions. Mark Twain's reflections on this era highlight the complexities of perceptions regarding Native Americans, who were viewed through a lens of both admiration for their noble traits and derogatory stereotypes that depicted them as savages. This duality illustrates the ongoing fight for acknowledgement and respect within the historical narrative of America.